I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anyone except Queen Bee. The state banquet was meant to be an evening of polished smiles, glittering protocol, and royal unity. But in one silent moment, Princess Catherine noticed the brooch on Camilla's gown, and everything in the room shifted. It was Diana's brooch, not something similar, not a symbolic replacement. It was the very piece Catherine believed should never have been worn without purpose, permission, or respect. Then Catherine did the unthinkable. Before we go any further into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine didn't blink. She didn't look away. For several seconds, the princess remained perfectly still, as though her entire body had absorbed the shock before her voice ever could. Across the table, Camilla felt Catherine's gaze settle on her, direct and impossible to ignore. Almost instinctively, the queen consort's fingers drifted toward the brooch. William noticed the movement first. The prince looked from his wife to the jewel, and something inside him seemed to harden. This wasn't just an ornament. This was a memory fastened to silk. This was grief displayed in public. The banquet mattered because it wasn't an ordinary dinner. A state banquet is a formal royal occasion held for distinguished guests from another nation, designed to reflect friendship, strength, and national dignity. Charles had wanted the evening to appear calm. The king needed unity after weeks of private tension, and he needed everyone in the room to believe the family still stood together. Catherine understood that too. She knew the price of interrupting the rhythm of royal ceremony. But she also knew the cost of staying silent. If she said nothing, Diana's name would once again disappear beneath royal protocol. William slowly reached beneath the table and took Catherine's hand, not to stop her but to steady her. She felt his touch and gently withdrew. That tiny movement told him everything. The princess wasn't acting out of anger. She was acting out of pain. Camilla looked down, then raised her eyes again, and her expression changed because she knew Catherine had recognized the brooch immediately. Charles noticed it too. The king's expression tightened, and for the first time that evening, his carefully maintained composure began to crack. The room kept breathing but only just. Catherine rose from her chair, and the silence became dangerous. Servers paused. Guests turned their attention toward the head table. William stood half a second later, close enough to show his support, yet far enough to let her speak for herself. Then the princess made the request no one expected. She asked for the service to stop. Camilla froze. Charles looked from Catherine to the queen consort, and the king realized the damage had already been done. This wasn't a minor break in etiquette. It was Diana's shadow returning through the one symbol no one should have used so carelessly. And before the room could understand why Catherine had brought everything to a halt, those closest to Diana's legacy began revealing what was truly at stake. Inside that room, the brooch meant something different to everyone. To Camilla, it represented royal acceptance. To Charles, it was a dangerous reminder of a past he had never fully escaped. To William, it was the return of his mother's shadow at the worst possible moment. And to Catherine, it was a line crossed publicly beneath the chandeliers, in front of the world. Catherine remained composed, but the hurt had already reached her face. She had spent years honoring Diana's memory with care, never turning it into a weapon, never using it to seek attention, never allowing grief to become a performance. That was why this moment cut so deeply. Diana wasn't simply a name from the past. She was William's mother, the woman whose absence still shaped his silence, his caution, and the way he protected his family. William saw the brooch, and his jaw tightened. The prince had always guarded everything connected to Diana with quiet determination, especially the pieces that carried public significance. To him, royal jewelry was never just decoration. A brooch, in the language of the palace, could become a message. And this one carried an old wound. A royal state occasion, a formal event where the family represents the nation before guests and diplomats, was meant to display unity. Instead, this single piece had transformed unity into something painful. Camilla tried to maintain her composure. She lifted her chin, held her posture, and behaved as though nothing had changed. But her hand gave her away. The queen consort touched the brooch once, then quickly lowered her hand, as if she had suddenly realized every eye near the table had followed the gesture. She had wanted acceptance. She had hoped the jewel would suggest that old wounds had finally healed. Instead, it sent a colder message. It suggested that someone else's grief had been borrowed without permission. Charles shifted in his seat, and the king's discomfort became impossible to ignore. He knew the brooch was connected to private conversations that had already divided the family behind closed doors. He also knew Catherine was not the kind of woman who challenged royal ceremony without reason. The king looked toward William, then toward Camilla, and his face reflected the weight of a past returning at the exact moment he needed absolute control. Catherine felt sadness first, then shock, then something even stronger. She looked at William and knew he had seen exactly what she had seen. The prince didn't need to say a word. His silence was filled with hurt, and that hurt gave her the strength to remain standing in a room that expected her to sit quietly and smile. Sophie noticed the change before anyone else fully understood it. The trusted confidant leaned gently toward Catherine, her voice low, calm, and heavy with warning. She whispered that this wasn't the first time the brooch had caused concern. Catherine didn't respond, but something in her eyes changed. William saw it. Charles saw it. Camilla felt it. That quiet whisper pulled the story back to the hidden moment that made Catherine's reaction unavoidable. This didn't begin at the banquet table. It started weeks earlier during a private family ceremony where Diana's personal pieces were being reviewed for a future memorial tribute. Catherine had asked for only one thing, that the brooch remain untouched until William decided where it belonged. But during that quiet gathering, Camilla made a request that turned a private memory into a royal dividing line. Catherine remembered that day with painful clarity. The gathering at Kensington had been small, quiet, and shielded from the outside world. A memorial tribute, a planned public event meant to honor someone's life and legacy, was being discussed for Diana, and every detail carried emotional weight. William entered the meeting already tense because anything connected to his mother was never simply history to him. It was his childhood. It was loss. It was the wound hidden behind the royal smile. Sophie sat beside Catherine, watching every movement with the quiet composure of someone who understood the family's unspoken pressure. The trusted confidant knew the brooch wasn't merely part of a royal collection. A royal collection refers to the family's personal and official pieces, often preserved for ceremony, remembrance, and public significance. When the sealed velvet case was placed before them, Catherine looked first at William. The prince didn't reach for it. He simply stared at the case, and his silence told everyone present that the piece still carried pain. Camilla had not been there for the opening part of the ceremony, but her name entered the discussion soon afterward. According to a documented account later shared during a private palace briefing, she asked Charles whether she could wear Diana's brooch at the upcoming state banquet as a gesture of unity. The queen consort believed the jewel could show that old divisions had finally faded. But Catherine saw the request very differently. To her, unity could never be created by taking another woman's pain and displaying it proudly before the world. William spoke with Charles later that same evening. The prince told the king the brooch should remain unworn until he personally decided its place in Diana's legacy. Charles listened, but he made no promise. That silence hurt Catherine even more than a refusal would have. She understood palace caution. She understood carefully chosen words. But this was different. The king knew how sensitive the brooch was, and yet he still left the door open. Catherine learned about Camilla's request through Sophie, who repeated the details from a recorded conversation preserved by a senior aide. The princess felt deeply unsettled, not because Camilla wanted dignity, but because the queen consort appeared willing to borrow it from Diana. William left that discussion visibly shaken, and Catherine watched him carry the pain without a single complaint. That was why the banquet became impossible for her to ignore. The moment Catherine saw the brooch on Camilla's gown, she knew the private warning had been dismissed. Charles had remained silent. The queen consort had gone ahead. William had been forced to confront his mother's memory before the public. So when Catherine rose from her chair, it wasn't impulse that guided her. It was the memory of a promise that had been broken. The room didn't erupt, froze. Catherine didn't raise her voice. She didn't shake. She simply looked across the table at Camilla and asked one question that pierced through every title, every rank, and every carefully practiced smile. "Why are you wearing it?" The words were quiet, but they landed like a verdict. In that instant, the banquet became a reckoning for the entire family. Catherine remained standing while the service came to a halt around her. A state banquet, in simple terms, is one of the monarchy's most formal dinners, held to honor important foreign guests and demonstrate the strength of the crown. That was why her decision carried such weight. She wasn't interrupting a private dinner. She was stopping a carefully orchestrated symbol of national dignity. And everyone in that room felt how serious it was. Camilla tried to respond with royal composure. She lifted her chin, looked toward Catherine, and began speaking as though the brooch were simply part of her evening attire. But halfway through her sentence, her voice tightened. The queen consort knew the guests didn't understand the full significance of the jewel. The people who truly mattered did. Catherine knew. William knew. Charles knew. And that made her composure seem thin, almost fragile. William slowly stood beside Catherine. The prince didn't speak over his wife. He didn't try to soften her words. He simply stood close enough for everyone in the room to understand she wasn't standing alone. His face carried the pain he rarely allowed anyone to witness. This was his mother's memory being handled in public. And he couldn't pretend it was merely an unfortunate decision. Diana's name was never spoken aloud. But it filled the silence between them. Charles leaned toward Camilla and quietly told her to remove it. The king didn't raise his voice. But the instruction still cut across the table. Camilla hesitated. Just one breath. One brief pause. Yet that hesitation changed everything. Catherine saw it, and her grief turned into disbelief. William saw it, and his jaw tightened. The king saw it as well, and his expression darkened. Because that hesitation no longer looked like uncertainty. It looked like defiance. Catherine wanted dignity. She also wanted the truth. That was the struggle within her. Part of her wanted to step back, sit down, and protect the evening from scandal. Another part knew that staying silent would turn Diana's pain into nothing more than decoration. So she held Camilla's gaze and refused to move. Camilla finally reached for the brooch, but the damage had already spread throughout the room. The queen consort's hand trembled slightly, and that small movement spoke louder than any apology ever could. She was exposed before guests who had arrived expecting royal unity, not a wound reopening before their eyes, and stepped toward Charles with a face marked by quiet certainty. The Princess Royal did not offer comfort. She offered a warning. "This is no longer about jewelry," she said in a low voice. "This is about judgment." And the moment Anne named the real issue, the palace stopped treating the banquet as an incident and began treating it as a crisis of authority. Behind Catherine's quiet stand was something the palace could not ignore. Moral authority. She did not yet wear the crown. She did not sit on the throne. She held no final power over royal protocol. But in that room, Catherine possessed something stronger than procedure. She carried William's trust. She carried Diana's memory. And she carried the public image of a future monarchy that could not afford to appear heartless. Charles understood the shift before anyone needed to say it. The king still wore the crown, and the crown represents the legal and public authority to lead the monarchy. But authority within a family can shift long before titles do. That night, power did not rest only with the monarch. It stood beside Catherine, because she had defended a memory the nation still held close. And William stood with her because he knew silence would have looked like betrayal. Afterward, Catherine sat in a side room, her hands folded, her face calm, while her heart still burned. She refused to soften what she had said. The princess knew the palace would worry about appearances, foreign guests, headlines, and protocol. Protocol simply means the strict rules that govern royal behavior during official events. But to Catherine there was a deeper rule. Human one. Diana's legacy could not be treated as a fashion accessory. Could not be borrowed for comfort. It could not be used to make old pain appear healed. William remained near the closed door, carefully choosing each word before speaking to Charles. The prince did not accuse his father recklessly. He spoke with restraint. But the hurt beneath his voice was impossible to miss. He told the king that Catherine had protected the family. She had not embarrassed it. She had stopped one painful moment from becoming a lasting insult. Charles listened. And for once, the monarch had no easy response. And stepped in with even greater clarity. The Princess Royal supported Catherine without drama, reminding Charles that symbols can wound far more deeply than words. Public speech can be corrected. A palace statement can be rewritten. But a symbol, once seen, remains in people's minds. Anne knew the family had survived scandals before. But she also knew Diana's memory was different. It wasn't only part of royal history. It was part of the nation's grief. Camilla's team moved quickly to contain the damage. They described the brooch as a symbol of reconciliation, a gesture intended to show peace between the past and the present. But Sophie quietly dismantled that explanation. The trusted confidant reminded them that reconciliation cannot be forced upon those who are still grieving. If William had not agreed, if Catherine had not accepted it, then it was not a gesture of unity. It was pressure disguised as grace. Charles looked down at the papers placed before him. Then he pushed them aside. The king knew that a palace asset review, an examination of who accessed royal items and who approved their use, could reveal far more than anyone wanted. Even so, he ordered it. Every piece connected to Diana had to be traced. Every approval had to be identified. That order changed the atmosphere immediately. Now the question was no longer why Camilla had worn the brooch. It was who had allowed it to happen. By midnight, the palace corridors were no longer quiet because of ceremony. They were quiet because of fear. Aides moved through the halls without speaking. Doors closed gently. The banquet had resumed only in appearance. Everyone knew the real event had already come to an end. Camilla had removed the brooch. Catherine had not returned to her original seat. And Charles was facing a truth he could no longer postpone. The king gave the private order in a voice that allowed no room for debate. Diana's personal jewelry archive had to be reviewed before any future use. A jewelry archive, in simple terms, is the secured record and storage of royal pieces, documenting where they are kept, who may access them, and when they may be worn. The king understood why it mattered. Diana's jewelry was not just another collection of palace items. Carried grief. Carried public memory. And it carried William's deepest family wound. Catherine sat away from the main table, feeling no sense of victory. The princess had stopped the banquet. But in doing so, she had also brought Diana's memory into a place filled with whispers, panic, and damage control. She had wanted respect, not spectacle. She had wanted the brooch protected, not turned into the center of a royal crisis. William stayed close beside her. The prince understood that her strength was costing her far more than anyone else could see. Camilla sat alone after the door closed behind her. The queen consort stared at the empty place on her gown where the brooch had been pinned, and that blank space seemed louder than the jewel itself. She had wanted the piece to speak of acceptance. Instead, it spoke of pain. She had hoped to appear confident. Instead, the evening left her exposed, questioned, and painfully aware that some symbols refused to belong to the person wearing them. Palace staff prepared a carefully controlled explanation for the guests, but no carefully chosen words could erase what had happened at the table. A controlled explanation simply means a brief official statement designed to reassure people without revealing the full conflict. Charles knew those words might protect the evening, but they could never protect the family from itself. The king picked up the access file, read through the chain of approvals, then quietly placed it back down. William reviewed the same file shortly afterward, and his expression changed. The prince had expected to find one private request, one poor decision, one mistake made under pressure. Instead, he discovered the brooch had passed through far more hands than he had imagined. That made everything feel less accidental. Felt planned. Felt approved. And that realization cut even deeper. Catherine looked toward the closed door and made a decision of her own. The princess did not ask for another briefing. She did not ask for more palace language. No more excuses. No more protection from the truth. She asked to speak with Camilla privately, without aides, without guards, and without anyone turning pain into procedure. William heard the request and fell silent. Charles heard it and looked older than he had all evening. Camilla heard it and lowered her eyes. And in that private meeting, the night finally stopped being about protocol. It became painfully human. There were no aides in the room. No prepared statements. No royal mask strong enough to hide what the banquet had revealed. Catherine and Camilla stood facing one another, not as the future queen and the queen consort, but as two women standing beneath the long shadow of Diana. For the first time that night, anger gave way to something even more dangerous. Honesty. Catherine stepped into the private sitting room with a calm expression, though her heart remained heavy. A private sitting room, in simple terms, is a smaller royal room used for personal conversations away from formal guests and public ceremony. That mattered because, for the first time that night, rank could no longer protect anyone. Camilla could not hide behind the banquet. Catherine could not hide behind silence. The pain had followed them both inside. William waited outside the door, refusing to interrupt, yet unable to walk away. The prince knew this conversation belonged to Catherine. But he also knew the brooch belonged to a wound that had shaped his entire life. Charles stayed back as well. The king understood that if he entered the room, the moment would become about authority once again. And this was no longer something authority could fix. It had to be human. Otherwise it would mean nothing. Catherine looked at Camilla and spoke with quiet sadness. She told the queen consort the brooch had no place in a performance of unity because Diana's memory still carried living pain. The princess never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Every word carried greater weight because it came without anger. She explained that unity cannot be created by wearing something tied to another woman's suffering. Has to be earned. Slowly. With respect. Camilla tried to defend herself at first. She said she had wanted the brooch to symbolize acceptance, to show that the past no longer needed to divide the family. But even as the queen consort spoke, her voice began to weaken. Catherine listened. Then she answered with the truth that filled the room. Acceptance cannot be taken from someone else's grief. It cannot be pinned to a gown and presented as peace. Camilla lowered her eyes. The defensiveness disappeared. In its place came shame. She reached for the case containing the brooch, opened it slowly, and lifted the jewel as though it had suddenly become heavier in her hands. Then the queen consort placed it gently on the table between them, and quietly said she would never wear it again. Catherine did not smile. She simply nodded. Because the promise could not erase the wound. But it could prevent the wound from being reopened. Camilla understood that now. Catherine understood it too. Moments later, William entered the room and saw the brooch resting on the table. The prince didn't ask what had been said. He didn't need to. Catherine's face told him the battle had changed. Camilla's silence told him the same. And in that silence, the night reached its turning point. But beyond the palace walls, the private meaning of that gesture was already becoming a public storm. By the next morning, the monarchy's private wound had become a national obsession. The images were everywhere. Camilla seated in diamonds. Catherine standing beside the banquet table. William watching with a face shaped by quiet restraint. No official explanation could compete with what people believed they had witnessed. Diana's memory had entered the room once again. And Britain reacted as though an old heartbreak had been reopened. Before breakfast, Catherine had become the name everyone was talking about. A major newspaper printed a close-up image from the banquet beneath one striking headline. The brooch that stopped the palace. A newspaper front page, in simple terms, is the very first page readers see before anything else. And this one mattered because it transformed a private royal conflict into a national judgment. Catherine was not portrayed as reckless. She was portrayed as protective. People saw a woman standing up for Diana when everyone in the room expected silence. William understood the danger immediately. The prince knew public sympathy could be a powerful force. But he also knew it could reopen wounds the family had spent years trying to contain. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered, leaving white flowers near the gates as a quiet tribute. Kensington mattered because it remained so closely connected to Diana's life. And those flowers made the story feel less like gossip and more like grief returning to the streets. Camilla faced the growing storm with visible strain. The Queen Consort appeared subdued as she left a private chapel service later that day, and cameras captured the weight in her expression. She had wanted acceptance. Instead, the public saw disrespect. She had hoped for unity. Instead, people across the country began asking why Diana's memory had been placed on her gown without the clear blessing of William or Catherine. Charles acted quickly, but even the king could not slow the emotional momentum of the public response. He approved a palace statement announcing new restrictions on the handling of personal items connected to Diana. A palace statement is an official message released to guide public understanding. But this one carried a deeper meaning. It showed the monarchy recognized that a line had been crossed. It also showed that Catherine's stand had forced meaningful action. One broadcaster summarized the entire controversy with a single line that quickly spread everywhere. This was not a jewelry mistake. It was a memory mistake. That sentence cut through every carefully prepared explanation. It gave people the words for what they already believed. Diana was not simply part of history. She remained a living part of Britain's emotional memory. And Catherine had defended that memory at the very moment it seemed most vulnerable. Camilla heard the public reaction and withdrew further into silence. Catherine heard it and did not celebrate. William heard it and understood the future had shifted once again. The public had not turned away from the monarchy. It had looked directly at the crown and demanded respect for the woman it had never forgotten. And when the noise finally began to fade, one truth remained inside the palace, stronger than any official statement. The banquet had ended, but its meaning remained. It became the night Catherine showed that loyalty to the crown does not mean remaining silent. It means recognizing when dignity has been crossed. Camilla lost the ability to treat Diana's memory as a symbol of convenience. Charles learned that old wounds cannot be managed through protocol alone. And William saw Catherine become the guardian of something even deeper than tradition. By the following morning, Catherine made her final decision. It was not about revenge. The princess did not ask for Camilla to face further humiliation. She did not demand a public punishment. She did not seek another painful confrontation. She asked for one simple boundary. Diana's most personal pieces would never again be used without the agreement of the family. A private protocol, in simple terms, is an internal royal rule that governs how sensitive matters are handled behind palace walls. This one mattered because it placed grief above image and respect above convenience. William supported the new boundary without hesitation. The prince saw it as protection for his mother's memory. But he also saw it as preparation for the future of the monarchy. He knew the crown could not ask the public for trust while treating pain like decoration. He knew Catherine had done what so many were afraid to do. She had stopped a royal event not to damage the family, but to preserve the part of it that still had a conscience. Charles approved the new restriction in heavy silence. The king understood the brooch had exposed something far greater than a single mistake. It had revealed how easily palace control could fail when human emotion was ignored. For years, he had tried to manage old wounds through careful timing, carefully chosen words, and carefully planned ceremony. But Diana's memory had never followed palace management. It lived in William. It lived in Catherine's determination to protect him. And it lived in the heart of the public. Camilla accepted the new restriction without objection. The queen consort understood that the brooch had cost her far more than one evening's dignity. It had reminded her that acceptance cannot be demanded, and peace cannot be worn like jewelry. She had hoped the symbol would close an old chapter. Instead, it proved that chapter was still tender, still protected, still capable of changing an entire room. And found Catherine later and spoke with quiet honesty. The Princess Royal told her that what she had done was not an act of defiance. It was stewardship. Stewardship means protecting something valuable for those who come after. And in that impossible moment, Catherine had protected memory, grief, and the trust placed in the monarchy. The princess listened to those words and finally found peace. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she had refused to let it be ignored. The monarchy survived the banquet because Catherine stopped it. That became the lasting truth. She did not weaken the crown. She reminded it what dignity truly means. The future could never be built by erasing the past. And Diana's memory would never again be used to decorate someone else's need for acceptance. No mystery remained. Only the lasting image of Catherine standing while everyone else remained seated. And forever changing the meaning of royal duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.